And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our very special guest remote author is Dana Gioia, the Catholic writer today, and other essays published by Wise Blood Books. Great to meet you, Dana, here on this program. Thank you for joining us.
To be here.
It's great to have you. People will have seen you back on during the summer in July with Father Mitch, talking about this and other topics. Now, you've got a very interesting background in the sense that you're the poet laureate, or had been, of California. You were also the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. What does somebody like that do, and how did that impact you as a writer?
Well, there are two different things. I never sought political office, and I was asked to lead the NEA, and I turned it down. And they chose somebody else who died after 7 days. Mm-hmm. And then I was asked again after 9/11, and I took it because I wanted to do some public service, especially in a time like that. And it seemed to me that people need art, but that the NEA had not done a very good job in terms of representing the people. Mm-hmm. And so for 6.5 years, I worked to bring the best art possible to the broadest cross-section of the United States, and to do things of inarguable value. Now, what that taught me as a writer was, in a sense, the importance of reaching the public and of creating a kind of conversation with the public. You know, I'm a poet as a writer primarily. I write criticism, poetry. I write words for music. Mm-hmm. But I think it's easy for a poet to be esoteric. Mm-hmm. It's easy for a poet to sort of be cut off from readers. And that was the same thing when I became poet laureate. I decided as my project I would go to all 58 counties of California. Mm-hmm. Most of them are rural counties. Most of them are small counties. Mm-hmm. And so I could actually be face-to-face with my audience, as it were, face-to-face with people with poetry. And you can tell immediately whether somebody's interested or not. Mm-hmm. And so it gave me a sense to try to revive poetry as a public art, something that's shared rather than a kind of private elitist art. Mm-hmm.
Now, the essay, The Catholic Writer Today, really is the beginning of this, what became this book. And you quote Flannery O'Connor, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you odd." Why did you decide to pick that quote at the beginning of the book?
Well, because I think, you know, if you are a Catholic, you are odd. Mm-hmm. If you're a Catholic, you are so weird compared to what Americans are supposed to do and believe nowadays. And so, and the good thing about Flannery O'Connor is that she says very true things in a way that is funny. Mm-hmm. You know, so if you're trying to say something that's really dark, it's best to say it as a joke.
Right. Now, you say here, "For years I pondered the cultural and social paradoxes." You stated simply, the paradox is this: that Roman Catholicism constitutes the largest religious and cultural group in the United States. Catholicism currently enjoys almost no positive presence in the American fine arts, not in literature, music, scripture, or painting. And that's what your essay is about. So give us, off the top of your head, why is that the case?
Well, it's weird that it is the case, because if you go back to 1950 and you look at American culture, many of the most famous writers were Catholic. Mm-hmm. Catholicism was, you know, part of the conversation of culture. And what is culture? Culture is a conversation. Different voices explaining their stories, arguing points. You know, in a sense, that's why culture is always moving. If you take a culture and you remove all the Catholics from it, your conversation is narrower, duller, mm-hmm. And less representative. I think several things happened. One is that as Catholics became better educated, mm-hmm. You know, they were now really too important to be Catholic. Mm-hmm. They sort of distanced themselves from the church. We also have this revolution, really, there's no other word for it, in the arts and intellectual life, which is determined to extirpate religion from public and cultural life. Mm-hmm. And so you have this forces against Catholic, but most importantly, there's a crisis of confidence among Catholic intellectuals and writers themselves. Mm-hmm. You know, there are people that are Catholic, but they're afraid to admit it in public, right. Because there's no upside. And so, I think that what we need to do now is essentially to reaffirm the importance of Catholicism as one of the key American identities.
Now, you say here the whole idea is that in identifying Catholic writers, more of them can identify ex-Catholics than probably Catholics right now. And then you mention the fact that we're really dealing with a secular culture. And then you go on to say there's an irony that this disappearance has occurred during a period when celebrating cultural diversity has become an explicit goal across the American arts.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so many examples. I mean, it was interesting. I would go to a Christian writers conference, and they would have 3 or 4 famous writers there. They were all people who would announce that they're no longer Christians, but they write about a Christian subject matter or whatever. I'm no longer a Catholic, but I write about evil nuns and evil priests. And that struck me as ironic, that the only people you could find are people that basically reject your own premise. And you see this, too, in terms of the media. If you're watching a television show and there's a priest or a nun, I guarantee you by the end of the show, they're going to be a hypocrite, they're going to be the criminal, or they may be demonically possessed or whatever. I mean, so, and so you have this weird thing. People begin to celebrate Hispanic culture, but nowhere in talking about Hispanic culture do they mention Catholicism. And in fact, if somebody who's Hispanic mentions Catholicism, they'll say, no, that's colonialism. No, that's, you being appropriated by Europeans. And so you have this very weird thing that if you simply back up and say, what is your personal experience? Now, I'm ethnic. I'm half Mexican. I'm half Italian. I was raised mostly among people who didn't speak English as their native language. Religion was a fundamental part of our daily life, our private life, our public life. And for any of us to talk about our life experience without reference to this, or by essentially rejecting this, it strikes me as an impoverishment, and a distortion.
You also write here is that the greatest misunderstanding of Catholic literature is classified solely by its subject matter. Then you go on to say, Catholic literature is rarely pious. In ways that sometimes trouble or puzzle both Protestant and secular readers, Catholic writing tends to be comic, rowdy, rude, and even violent. Catholics generally prefer to write about sinners rather than saints.
Well, I think that's true. I think, first of all, you have a better story usually if you're talking about a sinner,
right?
Because the outcome is uncertain. But if you think about, great Catholic 20th century writers, you've got Yves Lenoir. I mean, people who wrote something like The Loved One or Scoop, which are hilarious novels. A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, Flannery O'Connor. They tend to have kind of very theological imaginations, but the theology is expressed as a comedy. And you can go back to the Middle Ages. There's a work called The Divine Comedy, which starts off in hell. And so, what a comedy is not just something that's funny. It's about a rising action. It's about an action that moves towards redemption, from perdition into redemption. And I think that memory is very fundamental for Catholics, is they start in the fallen world among sinners, and the great Catholic narratives are the narratives of people in a fallen world trying to seek their own redemption.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned Yves Lenoir, and I talked about when Nancy Mitford expressed the surprise that Yves Lenoir could be so cruel and call himself a Christian, he replied, "You have no idea how much nastier I would be if I was not a Catholic. Without supernatural aid, I would not hardly be a human being. So, but for the grace of God, go all of us."
I think he's right. I think anybody who's watching us and says, well, I'm so inherently good. I don't need the grace of God. I don't need, in a sense, that sort of commitment to do this, to be a better person, is lying to themselves. I mean, every day I don't do something cheesy, bad, self-destructive, because I know that it's wrong, because it's not the person I want to be. And yet every day I have to do the decisions again, because we're essentially fallen. And that's why so much Catholic work is comic, because we want to be angels, but we're sinners.
Right. You say Catholics are probably no better or worse behaved than any other denomination. Their main moral advantage nowadays is they still recognize a sin when they commit one.
Well, it strikes me as one of the great illusions of our society is that humanity is inherently good, and that there's, really there's almost no sins. everything is self-expression. And I think that that's an illusion. But I mean, if you think about this, one of the interesting things about being a Catholic is that if you are fully living your faith, absolutely every moment of your life has importance. No matter how small the action is, how insignificant the action is, it has some importance, sub specie aeternitatis. And I think that's something that a writer knows how to do.
Now, you talk about the fact that 60 years ago, Catholics played a prominent, prestigious, and irreplaceable role in American literary culture. You even talk about the fact that you define yourself as a poet, talk about a strong Catholic presence in poetry, you list various people, but then you go to say the explosion of American Catholic writing in 2 decades after World War II has sometimes been described as a renaissance, but you describe us as being more back about 1900 than we are about 1950, right?
Well, yeah, that's one of the ironies is that, most Catholics, or American Catholicism is the religion of poor people, of poor immigrants. People came to this country with almost nothing. Mm-hmm. Ireland, from Poland, from Italy, from Mexico, and over a couple of generations, they achieved some kind of affluence, or at least some kind of security. Mm-hmm. And so if you go to 1900, what you see are largely uneducated Catholics. Very few people, except, the priests, had higher education. By 1950, you see this incredible renaissance of Catholic arts. Mm-hmm. If you made a list of the 50 most important writers in the United States in 1950, probably almost half of them would be Catholic. I mean, it was astonishing. But you go now, and you sort of say, who are the most famous writers in America? Probably none of them identify themselves as a Catholic. Even though those who are Catholics are try to keep it hush-hush. Right. And so ironically, after this huge economic, social, educational success, we seem more like our grandparents or great-grandparents, than we do, of the people at the mid-century. And so I think that one of the things I'm trying to do as a writer, in addition to my own work, which is obviously the center of my project as writer, is to help foster communities for Catholic writers, for Catholic artists of any medium.
Now, you mentioned here the Roman Church was often regarded as the faith most compatible with artistic temperament, which obviously changed, because then you mentioned people like Hemingway, converts, even Tennessee Williams at the end of his life, and of course the story about Oscar Wilde. So what changed?
Well, one of the things, I mean, it's interesting, Oscar Wilde, through most of his adult life, knew that he was drawn to Catholicism and that he should be a Catholic, but for all kinds of social and personal reasons, some of them sexual, some of them just the fact that he was, his, social stigma, he didn't do it, until his deathbed. But why was he drawn? Because Catholicism was the religion of beauty. The church's architecture, the music, the literature, the paintings, the sculptures, that of all the Christian denominations, Catholicism was the one that most naturally spoke to the artist. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting. I'm reading a bunch of 19th century biographies now, and these people are all dying in the church, mm-hmm. Because, they are drawn to it, and they know that if they're going to be Christian, this is where they belong. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's true anymore. I don't think that people associate contemporary Catholicism with beauty. Now, why does beauty matter? Beauty is one of the natural ways in which we perceive the world. We perceive our place in the world.
Now, you mentioned here, and I was wondering where you got this insight, that there's more rejoicing in heaven over one lost poet than 99 novelists who never strayed.
Well, I think it's the poet stabbing it to the novelist, but there's actually there's more Catholic novelists than poets. And I think it's because if people begin to tell their life story and they're Catholic, they can't get away from the church. Mm-hmm. Where poets, can lose themselves in the empyrean.
Right. You talk about anti-Catholicism has been common among the intelligentsia. And you talked about this situation where there was a National Book Award for Flannery O'Connor. Her editor Robert Giroux recalled one literary celebrity complaining, "Do you really think Flannery O'Connor was a great author? She's such a Roman Catholic."
Well, that was, kind of a rude remark back then. Now it's a common remark. I mean, I customarily hear intellectuals saying things about Catholics they would say about no other ethnic group or minority group.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it is considered virtuous to mock and castigate Catholics,
Now,
which once again is ironic in a culture which celebrates diversity.
right, like you make that point several times here in the book. You also say that I thought it was interesting that now is not, one quote was, nowadays the Catholic Church is not an institution for respectable people. A British novelist said that. You also said, as far as writing and kind of being segregated and a little ghettoized, I'm putting words into it, but the idea of the less established writers who've made Catholicism the core of their artistic identity work mostly outside mainstream literary life and small Catholic subculture that has little impact on general cultural life, which makes sense. Now, you chose to publish this with Wise Blood Books. How does that fit in?
Well, you know, I publish with large commercial publishers, but I chose to publish this book with Wise Blood because there was this fellow named Joshua Wren who, without any money, without any institutional help, just with a sense of vocation, was creating a press so that young Catholic writers would have a place to go. And I felt that I could, in a sense, help Wise Blood by giving them a book that I thought would sell pretty well. Okay. Because I really do believe that Catholicism does not suggest that we have community. It requires us to have community. It requires us to look on all of humanity as family, as brothers and sisters. And so I felt that as a writer, it was very important for me as a successful writer to make a community with these younger Catholic writers who in many cases have no publisher, are just starting out against all kinds of obstacles. So that to the degree we can make something like Wise Blood successful, Catholic writers, Catholic literature, and I think the Catholic Church itself are all better off. Right. We need Wise Blood to succeed, and we need dozens of other enterprises like it.
Now, you mentioned in the chapter here, to visualize the American Catholic arts today, don't imagine Florence or Rome, think Newark, New Jersey. What prompted that comparison?
Well, this is actually, as I was writing it, I realized this was the central metaphor. I'm not sure your ethnic background. I mean, what were your grandparents?
Irish-German, from New York.
Okay, so the Irish come in, the Catholics come in, they move into an old neighborhood. In that neighborhood, they build businesses, they have schools, they have churches, and Little Italy and these places like this were these vibrant communities. As their children became more successful, they moved into the suburbs. As they moved into the suburbs, they became vaguer about Catholicism. They lost a lot of their identity. And I'm suggesting that what we need to do, the same way that people are moving back into neighborhoods, taking these downtown things, these old buildings, and they're restoring them, and they're restoring these neighborhoods, that is the metaphor of what we need to do with the church and what we need to do with the Catholic arts. We need to re-inhabit and renovate our own tradition, because it brings us back to who we really are, rather than a kind of, and I'm not anti-suburban, but into kind of a generic suburban sense of who we are.
Yeah, we used to have regentrification, was kind of what they used to call it in Brooklyn and parts of the city. You also talk about, by now I've surely said something to depress, anger, or offend every reader of this essay. It depresses me too, but I won't apologize. And you go on to say, if we want to revitalize some aspect of cultural life, we must understand the assumptions and forces that govern it. The collapse of Catholic literacy life reflects a larger crisis of confidence in the church that touches on all aspects of religious, cultural, and intellectual life. Why do you think that's the case?
I think it's the case because that's what I observe. I mean, when I, everything from, going to Mass, to seeing the crisis of curriculum in Catholic schools, to seeing the number of people leaving the church, I think we're at a crisis point in the church, and also the outer society is dedicated, I think, to the extirpation of Catholicism. This is something that's gone on since the French Revolution, where they, killed or exiled the clergy, they closed the churches, they did all of these things. this thing's been going on for about 200 years, and we're seeing a kind of flaring up of, of that kind of radical anti-clericalism, anti-Catholicism in the United States today. And I think Catholics need to be conscious of it. It's silly for us to pretend things are better than they are.
Right.
We can solve any problem, but in order to solve a problem, you need to recognize the problem honestly.
Okay. Later on in the book, there's an interview that you gave, and you in responding to a question you asked, you said the notion of exile has always been present in my life. Why?
Well, because I'm from people that were either from the old country or were speaking Sicilian or speaking Spanish. I left my class through education. I left Los Angeles through business opportunities, to things. I've lived in New York. I've lived in Washington. I've lived in all these places. And so I have exiled myself from the very people, who raised me, but I have not exiled myself emotionally from them. I still think of myself as a working class Catholic. I go to, a parish that's, very much a kind of working class parish. And I have not turned my back on my roots. I think a lot of Catholics have. They kind of become distant from their roots, and so they cut them. Right. But if you cut the roots of a plant, it dies.
Now, when you were raised as a Stoic and moved away to become a poet?
Well, I was raised by people, who were not educated people. But my mother, working class Mexican woman from Los Angeles, had memorized poems in grammar school, as they called it then, and she used to recite these poems. And so I heard her, reciting these poems, and it at an early age, I recognized the enchantment of poetry and how it spoke to ordinary people. When I went to Stanford and Harvard, they said, well, ordinary people are too stupid to like poetry. Poetry's for intellectuals. I've never believed as a reader, and I've never believed that as a writer. And I think that by trying to reconnect with the average reader has been good for my poetry rather than bad.
Now, you say, I try not to interpret my own poems for two reasons. What are those?
Well, first of all, if I write a poem and I publish it, I don't think I necessarily understand it much better than anybody else. I'll give you an example. If I give you a poem that I've written, my understanding is that it's a great poem, and so I'm already blind. I have no idea of whether it's good or bad. You are, as a reader, have a better sense of whether it's good or bad than I do. And the other thing is that if I'm going to interpret the poem, I'm going to tell you what I did the week before and who I was in love with then and what was happening in my life. And that may or may not be in the poem. I'll tell you something that's really interesting that happens. If you write a poem that becomes well known, and I've written a few poems that are well known, somebody else will take it, they'll bring their life into that poem, and the poem will make complete sense, but it's not the sense that I, as the writer, put in that. And it's like the songs are that way, paintings are that way, these things are, they're that way. And so as a writer, it's like raising a kid. You're raising something that's going to move out of the house and have his or her own life.
I don't want my poems to provide answers. Then what do they provide?
What a poem provides is an experience that leads you through the right questions to whatever your answers are. I mean, if I say, life is good and this is that and the other, it's dead. I'm giving you conclusions. I mean, anybody who's a parent knows you can't teach your kid anything. You can tell your kid exactly what to do. They won't listen. What you can do is you can give them stories, you can give them examples, you give them things that when they find themselves in those circumstances, they can use to come up with their own good or bad answer. Okay. So what you're doing as a poem is trying to create a spell which makes you more alive, more alert, and better able, in a sense, to perceive something.
Is your poem "The Gods of Winter"? Do you consider that your most personal poem?
Well, it's "The Gods of Winter" is part of a series of poems I wrote after the death of my first son. My wife and I lost our first son at 4 months from sudden infant death syndrome. And the book, The Gods of Winter, are largely poems that came out of losing my first son, which changed me as a poet. And once again, I've created poems that other people who have lost children or have lost people can inhabit, can use. There's a poem of mine called Prayer, which was set to music by Morton Lauridsen, which is now often performed at commemorations, when children die, or let's say a student, bus crashes and some students are killed, and it becomes a vehicle that can, carry people's grief. And so what you're trying to do as a poet sometimes is to create a vehicle which is strong enough to hold the emotions of other people's lives.
A couple of quick questions before we have to go. Now, you write lyrics for music. How did you end up with an opera called Nosferatu?
Well, somebody wanted to write an opera, and it struck me as that no one had ever written a vampire opera.
Okay.
And if you are in a great one, and when I saw this silent movie, I realized it was a kind of redemptive tragedy. And so I wrote Nosferatu. It's a very Catholic opera. Actually, the Dies Irae and the Salve Regina, both are parts of this opera. So, once again, it's a tragic drama about, the struggle between damnation and salvation.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you one question. Who is Sister Camilla Cecile and Sister Mary Damien?
Well, these were two sisters of Providence who educated me. Sister Camille Cecilia was my piano teacher, and for 7 years, twice a week, I had a piano lesson and I had a music theory lesson, and it changed my life. Sister Mary Damien was my 8th grade nun, and I learned more in 8th grade than the other 7 grades combined. And she also had us, she told me, she kept a couple of us after school one day, and she says, I can't understand what you guys are saying. And I realized in retrospect, it was all people that were raised, like me, raised by people who were not English speakers. Mm-hmm. And she made us memorize and recite poems as elocution lessons.
Oh.
She not only introduced me to poetry, but she allowed me to speak well enough that I've been able to have a public career, in politics, in literature. And so to those two sisters, I owe much of the richness of my own life. God bless them both.
Well, we thank them as well, Dana, Gioia, because we're out of time. We thank you for finding the time to spend with us. The Catholic Writer Today and Other Essays, Wise Blood Books is the title, available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. All things Catholic. Check it out, and check us out next time on Bookmark. Thanks.